Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Back to Class Talk. For those of you who are visiting the Upper Valley for the weekend or joining us for homecoming, welcome back to campus. My name is Danielle Sparks, and I'm the Associate Director of Lifelong Learning. I work with the team of Alumni Relations that creates lifelong educational programs for alumni, parents, and friends of the college. Our office sponsors educational opportunities in Hanover, across the country, and around the world. If you're interested in learning more about our programs, I suggest you visit our website at alumni.dartmouth.edu to get the latest of all our events and what's coming up. Before we begin today's program, I'd just like to remind you, if you have a cell phone with you, if you wouldn't mind silencing it or turning it off so we don't disrupt the talk. Thank you. And also, I'm thrilled to tell you that President Wright will be available after the talk to sign some books, which are on sale. So if you'd like to do that, you can stop by outside and he will be able to sign up for you. So first, I'd like to introduce Nathan Brewski, class of 2010, and he's the founding president of DUSA, and he would like to make a brief announcement.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for coming out to what I'm sure is going to be an excellent event. My name is Nathan Brewski, and I'm the founder of the Dartmouth Uniform Service Alumni. When I graduated from Dartmouth, I did something that very few of my classmates did. I joined the U.S. military. And in the Vietnam era, of course, many men of Dartmouth answered their country's call. For some, ROTC was the key to making an Ivy League education at an institution like this financially possible. For some others, they took seriously the words of John Sloan Dickey, that they should make the world's troubles their troubles, and that there is nothing wrong with the world that better human beings could not fix. I think that this latter commitment to service has remained constant here at Dartmouth, even if you're in the classes today go into military service. Dartmouth is a leading school in the recruitment for the Peace Corps and Teach for America. And through the Tucker Foundation, students go across the country and across the world in serving peace, safety, and justice. I believe that the spark of service that ignited within all of those who answer their country's call and are beautifully chronicled in Jim Wright's book, that same spark is kindling within the students here. And we just have to reduce the frictions that stand in their way to service. And thus was born the Dartmouth Uniform Service Alumni, which is dedicated to three missions: networking military members of the Dartmouth community, attracting more veterans to Dartmouth, and inspiring students to serve. One way that we accomplished this last mission is by raising up those members of the Dartmouth community who have pursued service, often as just one element in a brilliant and vibrant career. And we raise them as role models for students to follow. We approached Jim Wright about lending us the honor of his name, and thus the James Wright Award for Distinguished Service was born. So far, it's been used to distinguish many veterans, including General Burke Whitman, class of 1978, Clinton Gardner, class of 1944, Ram Beers, class of 1964, and Jim Geiling, MPH, class of 2014. And this year, we'll be honoring another veteran, Dr. John N. Baldwin, of the class of 1955. Dr. Baldwin served in the U.S. Army Medical Corps with the 24th Evacuation Hospital in Long Binh, Vietnam. And in addition to serving a whole host of leadership positions in the medical community, he's also been incredibly active in the class of 1955 and as the president of the Sonora chapter of Vietnam veterans. We will present this award at DUSA's annual Veterans Day banquet gala, which is being held this year for the very first time outside of Hanover in Boston. It's going to be the day after the Dartmouth-Yale game in Fenway Park on Saturday, November 11th. And our keynote speaker is none other than Jim Wright. So it's going to be a real pleasure seeing you there. And all the details, including ticket information for this uplifting and extraordinary event, are going to be on DUSA's website. That's DUSA.dartmouth.org. And so to all who have served, Thank you for the example that you set for the students of this college.
Thank you so much, Nathan. Now I would like to welcome Ken Lundstrom from the class of 1955 to the podium. He will introduce today's speaker. He earned his Doctor of Philosophy from the University of North Carolina, and he is the retired president of Lundstrom Consulting. Currently, he serves as president of his class. He has been secretary, mini-chair reunion, reunion chair, past president, vice president, secretary of regional clubs, former district enrollment director, and he just is such a wonderful and valued volunteer for Dartmouth. So we thank him. So now, please join me in welcoming Ken Lundstrom to the podium.
Feel like I ought to check my ID after that. Good afternoon, everyone. Special thanks at the start of our meeting to Danielle Sparks and her team for the super efforts to bring this event to fruition. It is my honor on the behalf of the class of 1955 to introduce today's speaker. James Wright is President Emeritus and Eleazar Wheelock Professor of History Emeritus at Dartmouth College. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1957 and when discharged began his college education career, which resulted in a doctoral degree in United States history from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He joined the Dartmouth History Department in 1969 and from 1998 to 2009 served as the college's 16th president. An American historian, Dr. Wright is the author or editor of 7 books. I believe you are familiar with his most recent book, Enduring Vietnam, An American Generation and Its War, that focuses on the baby boomer generation who served in the Vietnam War and the human face of war. President Wright is particularly noted for his distinctive work with veterans, which began in 2005, visiting wounded Marines and soldiers in Washington, D.C. hospitals. Beyond their rehabilitation, he gave strong encouragement to the injured servicemen and women to continue their education. In addition, his efforts outside the hospitals provided for private institutions to be included in the post-9/11 GI Bill and a new educational counseling program for wounded U.S. veterans. This program still continues at Walter Reed Hospital. At Dartmouth, these efforts are manifest with the presence of veterans on campus, including 10 from the class of 2021 via the Posse Foundation. He serves on boards such as the Semper Fi Fund, America's Fund, and has been a member of the Campaign Leadership Committee for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund Education Center. He recently completed service on the board of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, the acronym IAFVA. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming President Jim Wright.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much. It's always a treat to see you and be on campus with your class. You're very generous friends in your class. Susan and I are delighted to see you here. I also want to thank Nathan for his good work, for his comments, and all that DUSA is doing. I do look forward to joining DUSA at the dinner in Boston following the game with Brown at Fenway Park this November. So I'm looking forward to that. And I also want to thank Danielle Sparks for all of her work for this program. She and Robin Albing and our dear friend Martha have just worked so hard this weekend. This weekend takes a lot of effort, and I think it shows in the quality of the programs that they've set up, and I'm not including my speaking as part of that quality of the programs. It's a special treat, though, for me to welcome again friends back to Dartmouth for Dartmouth Night and for homecoming. This is a special time. Susan and I always enjoyed immensely these weekends, and so I'm honored to be invited to spend a little bit of time with you, and I'm honored for you giving up part of your weekend to come over here this afternoon. Now, this program today promised some reflections on the Vietnam War, but I just want to remind everyone up front that these reflections is not about my participation in the Vietnam War. I served in the Marines from 1957 to 1960. I was not involved in the Vietnam War, but I do have some comments about the Vietnam War. Some things that I learned in researching and writing my book, Enduring Vietnam. And perhaps even more importantly, some reflections on just living through the years of the Vietnam War, as I did and as so many of us in this room have done. So let me share just a little personal background and a little context first. There's some biography, even some Dartmouth history that relates to my interest in doing this book. I came to Dartmouth in the summer of 1969. I joined the faculty then, the history department. Jerry Danielle, who's here, was on the search committee that appointed me, that recruited me. With a newly awarded PhD that I just received that summer, this was my first teaching job. And I thought, well, I'll go there. I'd never been to New England until I came out here for a job interview. I thought, well, I'll go for a couple of years. But obviously, 48 years later, this has been a lifetime commitment for me. While driving out to Dartmouth in the summer of 1969, in August of 1969, I recall vividly coming through New York State, upstate New York, and encountering there lines of VW buses on the road with all sorts of decals on them, and seeing hitchhikers on the road. They're just returning from the festival at Woodstock. Now this, of course, was iconic 1960s counterculture imagery. These were the baby boomers at Woodstock. Now, Woodstock was not something that was aimed to be about Vietnam or the Vietnam War, but it was never very far. That war was never very far from Woodstock. Janis Joplin and Joan Baez and Arlo Guthrie, Jimi Hendrix, they sang the anthems of the counterculture of the 1960s. And Country Joe and the Fish concluded their set with their anti-war anthem, I Think I'm Fixin' to Die. All of this helped to set the tone and the image of the 1960s. As one member of that generation observed in a note that he sent to me last year, Vietnam, he said, was the black hole around which all else swirled. That first year here in 1969, 1970 was an interesting one. When I was coming to Dartmouth, and actually in May of 1969, I saw on television some footage about the occupation of Parkhurst Hall in May of that year. And when I came onto the campus that fall, there was just a lot of conversation and debate back and forth on the part of students and faculty and others about the college's disciplinary action against the organizers of that group that occupied Parkhurst Hall. In the spring of 1970, President Hickey retired, and his successor, John Kemeny, had an eventful introduction to his new position. There were no 100 days for John Kemeny to get his feet in the ground, although he had been here then for, 15 years, I guess, so his feet were well grounded. But Dartmouth was marked in that spring of 1970 by major protests following President Nixon's announcement of American troop movements into Cambodia. This escalation of the war and the shooting at Kent State and at Jackson State energized many on this campus who had not protested earlier. I joined in these, and I ended up in, I guess, early May of 1970, accompanying a group of Dartmouth students down to Washington. We didn't march in any rally there. I'm not sure there were any major rallies at the time that we were there, but I wanted these students to talk to their representatives, and we spent some time on the Hill. We spent some time talking to others in Washington. I wanted them to share their views on the war, because this is how democracy worked. Now, certainly my own attitude toward the war was influenced growing up in a small Midwestern community surrounded by World War II veterans, including my father. And as someone who had joined the Marines at age 17, 5 of us in my high school class out of 25 boys joined the Marines. Another 7 or 8 joined other branches of the service. More of us went in the Marines that went directly to college for my high school class. So I became critical of the war, certainly as the war went on by 66, 67, 68. I think obviously most Americans were critical of the war. But I never blamed the troops on the ground for it, except for the Lieutenant Callies and others who had engaged in criminal activities, indefensible, atrocious, horrible criminal activities. I worried about the troops who were there. I worried about the nature of their assignments. Now, I have to say, for the next 30 years or so after this, I did not spend much time engaged in activity relating to Vietnam. But I can't say either that I ever really forgot about it. I had students in my U.S. history class over those years, and I often assigned them George Herring's book on the war to read. And we talked about the Vietnam War, certainly at the end of my survey classes in American history. But in 2005, as Ken said, I started to visit U.S. military hospitals and to work with and to support veterans. And this became an important activity of mine. So when I stepped down from the presidency in 2009, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do, but I knew I was going to continue this work. And almost backing into it, I also became a historian again. I published Those Who Have Borne the Battle, A History of America's Wars and Those Who Fought Them in 2012. And I taught some seminars in the history department. After Those Who Have Borne the Battle, I thought I was finished writing books. But my chapter in that book on the Vietnam War, I called that the chapter title Friendly Fire. Writing this chapter and thinking about a lot of things brought up a lot of thoughts and emotions. I knew that there were some issues having to do with this war that cried out for some greater understanding. And I knew that I still had a few things that I would like to say about it. So my book, Enduring Vietnam, An American Generation and Its War, was published last April. I tried in this book to tell the story of those who served in the war. The more I thought about the war, the more I read about it, the more I talked to people, the more research I did, the more I was concerned that we did not really know their story. After my book was essentially completed, it was just a year ago this month, Susan and I were in New York, and I was struck by a line in a Broadway play that we attended that summarized pretty fully for me what this book and my recent works over the last several years have been about. And I've used this line several times lately to describe my comments. When we were coming back from seeing the performance of Hamilton, the lyrics of one scene kept running through my head. Eliza Hamilton, the widow of Alexander Hamilton, sings with a chorus of founding fathers. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells the story? This was relevant to my work because in any war, in any armed confrontation, in any combat, the first questions are just the determinative ones, who lives and who dies. Apart from all other descriptions we may get about the nature of war or the experience of war, we have to realize this is the fundamental question. This is the tragic consequence. Indeed, we should never forget this. Killing or being killed is the cruel purpose of war. Stripped of all drama, stripped of romance, stripped of political debate. This is what war is about. That's why I've had so much trouble in recent years with the boots on the ground metaphor that some politicians and pundits have used to talk about sending in combat troops someplace. Boots on the ground. It's abstract. It's anesthetized. We are not talking about shoe leather when we talk about war. We're talking about our young. We're talking about our sons and daughters who serve. And we are asking them to confront personally and individually this question, who lives and who dies? But then the burden continues after the shooting stops. And to me, as a historian, as an old veteran, this was the lingering question. Who tells your story? The shared narrative of battles and wars fought, of those who have fought and those who sacrificed. This is critical for the framing of the story. For the story of war provides an account of lives that are lost. And I like to focus in on the individual lives that are lost. I've often talked about the Vietnam Memorial, panel after panel with thousands and thousands of names. But I tell people, focus in on what name. Don't be overwhelmed by the numbers. Focus in on one name and try to think of who this was and what their hopes and ambitions were. Telling the story can provide an account of a life lost. It reminds us of who this was, and it marks forever the lives of the survivors who knew them and who carry the emotions and carry their own experiences. Talking to veterans who have been there with buddies, as they call them in Vietnam, who died, was just such a powerful experience for me. But I think we all need to assist, not just their buddies. We all need to assist in the responsibility of carrying the stories And I think these need to become embedded in our national narrative. And this national narrative is about more than war stories and colorful tales. It's about tragedy and sacrifice and courage and memory. It's an important part of what I've tried to do in this book, to remind readers of the human face of war, the human cost of war. I interviewed 160 people for this book. In fact, 17 Dartmouth Vietnam veterans participated. I called these 160 people my collaborators. I sent each of them a personally inscribed copy of the book last spring when it was published, and thanked them for what they did. They shared with me many powerful stories, personal stories, largely of combat experiences, because I really wanted to tell the story of what it was like on the ground in Vietnam. And these stories affirmed my belief that in so many cruel and perverse ways, there maybe is nothing more human than war. That instantaneous engagement in combat tests one's values, one's courage, one's sense of self, one's relationship to other people. It's a very human test. It might be in the cruelest environment possible, but it's a very human test. One account by a family member that I just talk about in the book reminds us of the reach of war. I talked to somebody who was really a kid. I call many of the Vietnam veterans that I interviewed, I still refer to you as kids. It's been a number of years, but I'm telling about the story when you were kids. But I talked to one person who was probably 15 years old in 1969 about his brother. He lived in Pennsylvania. He was home alone one day and there was a knock at the door, and he went to the door and there were two very dignified looking young men in army uniforms at the doorway. And they asked if his parents were home, and he said no, they were out, but they just called and they should be back in 15 minutes. And would they wait for them? And they said yes, and they sat on the porch. He told me he went out and joined them on the porch. He was so excited to see these soldiers there. He said, I have a brother. My brother's in the Army. My brother's in Vietnam. My brother flies helicopters. We just got a letter from him. And he ran in the house and he brought out a picture of his brother. And he said, do you know my brother? My brother's going to be home next month. I can't wait to see him. The young man's parents came home, and these two soldiers told them that their son would not be coming home. And this younger brother told me he ran up into the woods behind the house and just wept and wept and wept. He was embarrassed for continuing to ask him, do you know my brother? And obviously he was absolutely grieving over the loss of a brother that he looked up to so much. This is deeply imprinted on him, and that's why the human ripples from wars continue and continue and continue. The father asked what day this was that the son was killed, and they said on June 6, 1969. And he said, God, I'll never forget that day, will I? 25 years before that, on June 6, 1944, I went onto the beach at Normandy. And now my son is gone. Now my book does provide a history of the war. I am a historian. And as a historian, I think it's important to set context and frame the world of the Vietnam generation. I have to say, I'm not very kind to those who sent them to war. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, those two particularly, Richard Nixon. I think what I find so frustrating, and it still distresses me greatly, they had all of their own doubts and reservations about the war, but they didn't share them. They kept insisting, don't worry, it's going to be fine. We're going to get through this. They allowed politics and their ego to dominate, and candor and honesty were just set aside. In working on the book, I knew that I had to visit Vietnam. I'd never been there. And I didn't obviously just want to go to the current tourist spas and thriving cities, but I knew I wanted to get out into the high country, up in the highlands, central highlands. I wanted to get up in, back in the jungle. I wanted to get deep into I-Corps. I wanted to get to those places where the baby boomer generation fought and died. I was able to organize through the group Military Historical Tours such a visit in late summer of 2014, 3 years ago. And it was only in visiting the Delta and going in a small boat around some of the canals and waterways that I could fully understand why those kids who had been there told me these were scary places. They continue to be scary places with the brush hanging over these narrow canals and waterways. We went out along the Cambodian border. In fact, in something out of a movie, my group was detained by Vietnamese police because we had gone into a restricted area, and we spent 3 or 4 hours in the most godforsaken little police station waiting for them to figure out what to do with these Americans that had been in this restricted area. I traveled up to Da Nang, and I went out to see the pilings that remained along Liberty Bridge, which anyone who served up there would surely remember. I visited that area that the Marines called Dodge City, southwest of Da Nang. I looked across at Charlie's Ridge, still dark and foreboding 45 years later. I went to Hue, and I walked around the ancient citadel that had been the site of intense fighting during Tet in 1968. And I went up to the old demilitarized zone and went west along Highway 9 out to Laos border. I went to the Rock Pile and Mutter's Ridge, Con Tien, and finally Khe Sanh, where the Marines had been surrounded by North Vietnamese Army soldiers early in 1968. I climbed Hamburger Hill up in the old Ah Sha Valley. It was hot and unbelievably humid. I had met some North Vietnamese veterans of that war in the nearby village of Ah Louis. And I talked to them and tried to interview them through an interpreter and got some stuff from them, but it was hard. They were certainly cautious with what they said to somebody they never met. And I said, I'm going to climb the hill. Will you come with me? And of the 3 that were there, 2 of them did. The third one was too badly injured, a war injury. He waited down at the end of the trail for us to come back down from visiting the hill. I stumbled and slipped and sweated on this steep trail, and I wondered how the scared young men of the 101st Airborne Division had climbed it in 1969. Knowing they were over 50 years younger than I was not a sufficient explanation, for nobody was shooting down at me, and I wasn't carrying 50 or more pounds of equipment and ammunition when I walked up that trail. It took those Americans in 1969 10 days to reach the top of the hill. It took me 2 hours. An important qualifier, it took 10 days for those who reached the top. Some of the units that went in on May 10th, 1969 had 70 and 80% casualties over the next 10 days. Now, before we set off to walk back down the trail from Hamburger Hill, I told the North Vietnamese veterans I had something I wanted to do there. And I pulled from my pocket a small piece of lead sulfide, really. It's called galena. It was a small piece of lead that I'd picked up after I got out of the Marines. I was working in the Graham mine near my hometown of Galena, Illinois, which was organized as for lead mining in the 1820s. When I worked in the mines, my boss was a World War II veteran who had a Purple Heart from that war, and I got to know very well and be fond of his son, Michael Lydon, who was a great kid. Michael Lydon died on Hamburger Hill on May 15, 1969, when he was struck in the chest by a rocket-propelled grenade. I told the North Vietnamese about him through our interpreter, and I said that this young friend of mine never reached the top of this hill, but that I wanted to leave behind something enduring that bore the name of our hometown, Galena, Illinois. And so I buried that piece of lead under the red soil on the top of Dong Ap Pia, Hamburger Hill. And I can assure you, lead, Galena, will last as long as the red clay of the top of that hill will last. A few days before that, I had located the rice paddy where Billy Moyer of the class of 1967 had died in an ambush in July 1968. Billy Moyer was a remarkable student. I never met him, but I knew his brother and sister and his parents and his classmates well. He wanted to go in the Marines after he graduated, and just a few weeks after he went into the country, he was killed. He had been a great hockey player and a soccer player here. And hockey pucks are easier to carry around than soccer balls, so I took a hockey puck that Coach Bob Gaudette gave me, and I buried it in the rice paddy where Billy Moyer had died. It's still a rice paddy. The Vietnamese were working those fields when I was there. And ironically, just 2 miles from there, about 3 kilometers from that place, I buried a small New Hampshire map with a flag on it that meant that underlined Dartmouth. And Billy Moyer's classmate, Duncan Slay, had died in a firefight there just a few months after Billy Moyer's death. In both places, I covered the buried pieces with some dirt that I'd taken with me from the Dartmouth Green. And I threw some of this dirt into the jungle area where Danny Barger of the class of 1965 had died when his fighter jet was shot down. So when I was up in the heat and the humidity of this triple canopied jungle on Hamburger Hill, my understanding, my own memories, my personal memories, my Dartmouth experience, my feelings and my emotions, all of these flared. And I knew that I really wanted to tell this story about the war and about those who fought there. Some of these stories literally jump from the jacket of my book. I have on the back some pictures that I selected, and one of them is Michael Lydon, the kid from my hometown. There's also a picture there of a young Army nurse, Sharon Lane. She was one of 8 nurses who died in Vietnam just 6 weeks after arriving there. She was the only nurse that was killed in a direct enemy attack. She was from Canton, Ohio, and she served at the 312th Evacuation Hospital at Chu Lai. And Sharon Lane had spent a lot of her time there, including all of her free time, looking after Vietnamese in the nearby villages. She was killed in a rocket attack. I interviewed some who were with her there, and one Army nurse told me that Vietnam was never the same after she learned about Sharon Lane's death. There's a picture of Lenny Hickson, this smiling kid in his high school graduation suit and tie. Lenny Hickson was one of a set of triplets born on the Navajo reservation. And after he graduated from Window Rock High School, he joined the Army. Lenny was a paratrooper and a machine gunner, and he was remembered and recognized by his buddies for his generosity and for his strength. He carried their loads when they needed help. He sacrificed his sleep to look after them when they were supposed to be on watch. He died on Hamburger Hill. One of his buddies wrote to his parents then and shared with me the letter. What a privilege to have known such a man. Lenny was buried at Fort Defiance Cemetery on the Navajo Reservation, and following a Catholic funeral there, the Navajo elders performed their ceremony for this young warrior, saying this was a warrior, this was one of us who died. One of his triplet sisters threw herself on his coffin. She begged to be buried with her brother. And then there's Jimmy Hickey. Jimmy Hickey is from Quincy, Mass. He was part of a Irish Marine culture there. He was going to join the Marines with some of his buddies when he was a high school junior, only 17 years of age. He delayed because his girlfriend persuaded him not to go, to stay in high school for his senior year. But the following winter, in February of 1968, one of that original group that he was going to join with was killed in Vietnam. So Jimmy Hickey and 4 others dropped out of school a month before graduation, literally a month before graduation, and they joined the Marines. He was in Vietnam by early 1969. He died in May. He was on Hill 55, northeast of Liberty Bridge. I walked around that site in the hill where his unit was when he was killed. This was what the Marines called Dodge City. There's a square in Quincy that's named in honor of Jimmy Hickey. And at the last count that I saw, there were 19 other squares in that city remembering young men from Quincy who died in Vietnam. Jimmy Hickey's family shared with me a poem that his uncle Phil Burns wrote that was read at his funeral back in Quincy. It was he titled it The Magic Horse. I reprinted actually in the book. When Jimmy Hickey was young, really young, he was young when he died, but when he was really young, he insisted he had a magic horse. And he insisted he kept this horse tied up by his bed every night. And this horse protected him overnight. And the horse took him to some wonderful faraway places in his dreams. So his uncle wrote about this, about the horse that protected him. And he concluded his poem by saying, "Dear Jim, I'll lead you home upon your magic horse." The poem evoked for me Peter, Paul, and Mary's Puff the Magic Dragon. Dragons live forever, but not so little boys. I'd like to just turn back for a minute, though, from my book and talk about this weekend and this community. And in doing so, closing a loop on Vietnam, on Dartmouth, and on Dartmouth Night and what it means. 54 years ago, on Dartmouth Night, in October of 1963, a student leader stood next to President Hickey at Dartmouth Hall to speak. It had been a dry fall, the fall of 1963, so upon the fire department's recommendations, the college did not have a bonfire this year. But this senior speaker, who was the head of Paleopolis, said not having a bonfire is no big deal for Dartmouth people coming back. He reminded the people that Dartmouth goes beyond a symbol of a bonfire. Indeed, he said, even Dartmouth Night itself inadequately captured the spirit of this college that he was just entered his senior year into. And so to conclude, to describe his Dartmouth spirit, he concluded his remarks by reading to the crowd on that Dartmouth night the closing lines from the poem of Edwin Frost of the class of 1930. He read, "Around the girdled earth is wisdom, end of smallness, this deepening horizon, this jewel of all the northern lights, which leaves no darkened sea uncharted or hope against the future dead. An anchor for the misty dream of living, this hour, this standard, this religion, this Dartmouth." The next spring, Bruce Nickerson of the class of 1964 graduated. 2 years later, flying off of the USS Kitty Hawk, Bruce and his co-pilot went down in their A-6 Intruder aircraft in the Gulf of Tonkin. His body was never recovered, and Bruce Nickerson was the first of 15 Dartmouth men who would die in Vietnam. I know you have a full weekend ahead of you, and of course I'll be happy to respond to questions. But this full weekend that's in front of you involves friends to see, parades in which you'll march, promises to keep, and miles to go before you sleep. Miles to go before you sleep. Many thanks for joining me here this afternoon. Have a wonderful and a safe weekend, and let's all cheer Dartmouth to a victory over Yale tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we have some time for a few questions. If you could please wait for the microphone because we're recording this session, that would be appreciated. So we have a question here.
I'm Peter Knight, class of 62. I was curious, with this recent long series of television programs, whether you have any reflections on that in terms of your own experience and in your research.
You mean the Ken Burns series on the Vietnam War? Yeah, I missed one of the episodes, and I have it on tape. I haven't seen it yet, but I certainly was downstairs. Susan joined me for most of it, and we did watch them. And I've been a fan of Ken Burns since I chaired a committee that gave him a prize from the Organization of American Historians in the middle 1980s, so I go back a long way. I'd seen some of the footage down at his studio for this, and I really I marvel at what he did. And of course, he did a blurb for the jacket of my book, which makes me even more grateful to him. I thought it was a very powerful series. You know, I thought coming into it, it might play the same role that the series on the Civil War did 25 years ago. I'm not sure. It played a different role than that, because that was just reminding us of the trauma of the Civil War, but nobody had experienced it. Vietnam is still pretty vivid in the memory of a lot of people in this country. And I think some of the veterans have been critical. They thought that their story, you know, that there was too much of an effort to be even-handed, and I'm not going to criticize Ken Burns for that. Some historians have fussed about it not dealing with the richness of the subject and the complexity of it. And you can't do that in a television series. I really admire what he and Lynn Novick and their crew did in terms of the footage that they pulled together for that. Just some remarkable footage. It's hard to watch that. It's hard to listen to the interviews that they had with people there and not understand what the experience was. So I applaud it greatly, but I just really think Ken Burns is a marvel. He and Lynn Novick actually co-did this, but he's a remarkable person.
Frank Cale, also class of 62. For the last couple of weeks, I've been helping the class review the Ken Burns, Lynn Novick series with commentary from various journals and criticisms and the whole 9 yards. What I'd like to ask you as a historian is, at the beginning of the series, he sets it up, that is the war, the whole war, as either a fight against communism, which leads to the dominoes metaphor, or the last gasp of Southeast Asian colonialism. And depending on how you read each, you're going to come out on how you read the war, and in particular his treatment or their treatment of it. My sense, maybe you can give me yours, is that he never comes down to say whether it was indeed a war at the end of the colonial era, and presumably the United States should not have gotten involved with what was France's swan song, or it was really a war about holding back communism. I think LBJ said, if you don't stop them on the porch, they're going to chase you into the kitchen. What's your take on how Ken Burns has handled that dichotomy that he himself has set up?
Yeah, I think he states, he shares the dichotomy. I don't know that he was looking for a way to resolve it, and I'm not sure that there is a resolution. There is no doubt on the part of many of the Vietnamese in the 1950s and 60s, they saw the fight against the United States as sort of part of an ongoing battle against colonial powers. We may have thought of it quite differently. We certainly were not looking to establish a colony there, but they saw it the same way, and I don't think you can take away their perspective on this. The Viet Minh had fought against the French. Now the NLF and the North Vietnamese Army were going to fight against the Americans coming in. That's just a fact, and I don't know that you say one of these is right or wrong. Was it a war against the falling dominoes of communism? That's how many people in this country described it. I can't quibble with whether Lyndon Johnson and Dean Rusk were convinced of this. I think Vietnam was a crucial part of a Cold War contest with the Soviet Union, but in many ways Vietnam became sort of a surrogate for this broader war. I'm not sure that it was ever really about Vietnam. It was really about standing up, we thought, to the Soviets. We have been talking about this since World War II, the need to do that. The Soviets weren't there. They were sitting back, and they were never that comfortable with the war, although surely they supported the North Vietnamese. So I do think both these things came into play. But again, I think that people talk about the quagmire of Vietnam that Johnson and Kennedy got caught up in. And there is some element of a quagmire there, but it's a quagmire first that they helped to create, because they have been part of this rhetorical battle in the 1950s to remind Americans of our need to stand up against communism. And Lyndon Johnson did say, if it's not in the front porch, it'll be in the kitchen. He also said, and others said, if we don't fight them here, we'll have to fight them in the streets of Los Angeles. I don't think there was much likelihood of the NLF, the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese coming to Los Angeles, but that's the way that this was defined. And when I interviewed these kids who went to Vietnam, time and again they talked about this. They talked about their responsibility. These were the children of World War II veterans. They grew up in a world where they have been alerted time and again that it was a dangerous world. They've been told time and again to be careful. In my small town in the Midwest, for God's sakes, we had duck and cover drills in the school in case the Russians decided to bomb a Mississippi River town in northwestern Illinois of what, 4,500 people maybe or something like that. They grew up in this world, and they also grew up in a world where they were told you have a responsibility. And I think that 40% of the baby boomer generation served in the military. There are more baby boomer names on the Vietnam Wall than went to Canada or who went to prison. To be sure, there are plenty of others who found ways to evade the draft, and that's not my point, but they did serve. And I think that they were misled. To some extent, President Johnson and Kennedy were misled, but I don't spend too much time making excuses for them because they fundamentally knew better, and they still went ahead. But they kept thinking it would end quickly. We've seen that scenario time and again. They thought if we flex our muscle, these people will come to the bargaining table and we'll get this over with.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Sir, I'm John Hanley, class of 71. My first job after being commissioned in the Navy was to take all the NROTC gear and find other units to take custody of it. But I'd like to ask you about your thoughts on the role of Dartmouth in educating officers for the military services.
I think Dartmouth does have a role. I've spoken one of the few formal college activities I regularly speak at, and on commencement weekend I speak at the commissioning ceremony for our new officers, and I tell them about the rich tradition that Dartmouth has in serving in the military, and we do. One can point out there aren't as many today, and there surely are not as many today. But there aren't as many that need to go today. It's a much smaller military force. So I applaud those who serve. We do have an important ROTC program. The numbers are going to be high. President Jim Kim a few years ago asked me if I would go down to the Pentagon and talk to some people about maybe establishing an NROTC unit here. Quite frankly, they weren't that interested because they knew the numbers would not sustain the cost of having another NROTC unit here. It is a different world. But as I tell the graduates, they joined because they wanted to join. They don't have a draft hanging over them. They don't have all of the other things in their lives that say you've got to serve. They joined because they want to join, and I think that we need to continue to provide them that opportunity.
So please, everybody join me in thanking President Wright for his talk today.
Thank you very much.